and welcome to CSIS. I'm Will Todman, a senior fellow in the Middle East program here, and I'm joined by some of my colleagues to discuss the latest in the war between Israel and Iran. We are now in the 5th day of the conflict between the two countries. That has left at least 224 people dead in Iran and 24 dead in Israel. And while Iran continues to fire volleys of missiles at Israel, Israel has reportedly achieved air superiority over Iran and has conducted widespread strikes on various targets across the country. The US role seems to be shifting. Initially, President Trump and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said that the US had no role in these operations. But over the last day or so, we've seen that rhetoric shifting. And just today, President Trump posted on Truth Social, unconditional surrender. He also said we when discussing military operations being conducted in Iran. So to discuss the immediate implications of this conflict, but also to zoom out a bit and try to better understand where this all might be going, I'm joined by three of my colleagues at CSIS. Mona Yacoubian is a senior advisor and the new director of the Middle East program. Dr. Doreen Horshig is a fellow in the project on nuclear issues. And Dr. Dan Byman is the director of the Warfare, Irregular Threats and Terrorism program. And you can see much more of their bios online. For those of you watching online, you can submit questions, which I will pose to our group today by using the button on the CSIS website. But Dan, I would love to start with you, please. How do you evaluate the success of Israel's military operations so far in Iran?
So I think we should have our session today and then maybe a month from now do another one and then another year from now a third, and I'll give you a different answer each time. So if you look at the immediate results in Iran, Israel appears to have hit some of Iran's nuclear sites, but certainly not all. And it has done significant damage, it appears, to Natanz, one of the most important. But Fordo, another site, seems largely intact, and a lot of the more dispersed sites have not been hit. Israel has, however, done significant short-term damage to the Iranian military. It's hit the leadership, hit numerous targets, but to be clear, they've been replaced. Israel has also rendered the missile response of Iran less effective. Now, Iran is trying to launch very large salvos at Israel, and that's difficult in part due to the command disruption, but also it appears that as Iran tries to take missiles from storage to launch areas, that Israel is disrupting that process. But again, we see some Iranian response. So far it's been pretty good from an Israeli point of view. I think the casualty ratio you mentioned at the beginning is one not only that favors Israel, but Israel has been willing to accept that. But I would say that it hasn't been an operation that's been scot-free for Israel. The one thing I would stress, though, is the future from a military point of view looks more promising for Israel in that it has now achieved almost complete air supremacy. And I'd point out that, what are we, over 3 years into the Russia-Ukraine war, and Russia is still not there over Ukraine. And the broader intelligence dominance that Israel has shown is likely to pay dividends. But to do this operation successfully in the long term is incredibly difficult, and it's unclear to me if Israel is going to achieve that.
And you've talked about various types of dominance that Israel has achieved. Is it fair to say that Israel has achieved escalation dominance at this stage?
So maybe. Certainly if Israel is believed to be a nuclear power, Israel is a country that has a superior conventional military. However, Iran has responded in the past with international terrorism, and that's very difficult to stop. So it does have tools in its toolkit that it can still respond with. But there's no question in terms of the broader military force, Israel has the upper hand.
Thank you. And Mona, I want to come to you next to better understand what options Iran has at this point. We're just 5 days in, but the situation has changed so rapidly. What options does Iran have to either retaliate or escalate? And also, I think quite importantly, is there an off-ramp emerging?
So I think Dan actually laid down quite well the ways in which Israel has achieved different types of superiority. But also I think Dan's also correct that Iran still has tools in its toolbox. beyond international terrorism, which is something that could play out over months, if not years, Iran also has some asymmetric capabilities. So a number of Iran's proxies have taken a huge hit over the past many, many months by Israel, certainly Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas. But the Houthis remain a capable proxy that has not shown any reticence to join the fight. Iran itself so the Houthis could undertake attacks. There are Iranian-backed militias in Iraq that retain lots of capability, especially if the U.S. should get involved. We could see some of these Iraqi militias, Iranian-backed groups, going after U.S. targets in Iraq. Iran could try some interesting ways to snarl maritime traffic, cause more problems, not necessarily blocking the Strait of Hormuz, which would really be, I think, kind of a desperate move by Iran. We're not at that point, but I think we could easily see Iran use a variety of means to kind of mess with maritime traffic and even perhaps go after naval targets and those kinds of things.
And that would be a big shift in Iran's regional strategy, where over the past few years we've seen Iran trying to integrate into the region, restore ties with Arab Gulf states, and those measures that you just mentioned would really undermine that, I think, and they would cause pain to those Gulf Arab states.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. I think Iran has actually made a real point of not trying to draw the Gulf in. It has not retaliated or done anything that would anger its kind of warming, its new Gulf Arab allies.
And Mona, something you didn't mention there was anything to do with its nuclear program. So I want to bring in Doreen now to help us better understand the options and the choices that Iran might now have as it relates to the future of its nuclear program. As Dan mentioned, I think at the start, we have not yet seen the destruction we've not yet seen the destruction of the Fordow plant, which is deep under this mountain, extremely well fortified. But what might Iran choose to do now with its nuclear program?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and we have to be careful not to make predictions because we're still kind of waiting on the damage assessment here to see really what the extent of the attacks have been with regards to the nuclear program. But I see three ways that Iran might go. And the first one is that it might be now more determined than ever to actually pursue nuclear weapons for deterrence purposes, because the attacks might have shown Iran that it actually does need nuclear weapons to deter such strikes that we've seen. And as Dan already pointed out, so we have the Fordow facility that really hasn't seen any damage as far as we know. So Iran, if it wanted to sprint to a nuclear bomb, could use that facility to get fairly quickly from that 60% to the 90% that would be needed for a nuclear warhead. So that could be a short-term option to get to that nuclear weapon, but then the more long-term is to see what's still left from the nuclear program and build on that. And another option, which I think is a little less likely than the first one, is to look for that off-ramp that Mona was touching on, where I know we've seen mixed signals from the US, but there has been that White House statement yesterday kind of offering or asking Iran to reconsider negotiations. So Iran might also be looking for that off-ramp to consider diplomacy if damage continued to rise. And Iran may want to lose all parts of its nuclear program. Now, Israel would probably not support this. We know from history that Israel hasn't been very supportive of diplomacy and negotiations, so we might see continued counter-proliferation attacks there on the Israeli side. And then I think the third way, which is, I would say, the least likely choice, is that Iran might determine that the nuclear program is not viable at all and forego all nuclear developments. But that is just an option, but I see that as the least likely one.
And can you explain a bit more sort of why Iran has this nuclear program in its own telling, the difference between the civilian energy program, and as far as I know, until last week, the US intelligence community continued to assess that Iran hadn't made the decision yet to break out into nuclear weapons to pursue that. But can you give a bit more background about that, please? Yeah, so the intelligence assessment was a little while ago. And things have already changed a bit since then. And we had the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, actually put out a statement last week saying that Iran has been in violation of its obligations. And Iran itself has expressed interest in building a third nuclear enrichment site. So we have seen those steps where there are clear signs that Iran is moving towards a nuclear weapon, but it hasn't yet obtained that nuclear weapon. I think Israel here has seen or perceives Iran to be a bit closer to an actual nuclear weapon than that some of the rest of the international community. Mm-hmm. Dan, I want to shift to the role of the US in all of this, because I think even over the last 5 days, or at least a little longer over the last week, the rhetoric has changed quite a lot coming out of the White House from various officials. And I did want to cite a poll that YouGov commissioned over the weekend that said that 60% of the US public oppose US involvement in this war, and 16% are in favor of it. But from the noises that seem to be coming out, it seems at least a possibility that the US might become involved. So how might US involvement change the trajectory of this war?
So let me begin by giving some thoughts on the polling data. Polling on the use of force is very sensitive to the positions of leaders. And if President Trump comes out strongly either against intervention or for intervention, it's going to affect those numbers, but in a very large way. And so I think that over time, as the United States or another country becomes involved in a conflict, the polling data starts to be a bit more independent of leadership positions, but the ability of leaders to kind of set the agenda is very strong at first. If the United States does intervene, it could have dramatic effects, but there are lots of question marks. So one of the biggest, as Doreen said, is about the Fordo facility. So there's an immediate question of what to do about one of Iran's most important facilities, well guarded, deep in a mountain, and the United States has the munitions to destroy this. And this is something that this is in part why these munitions were designed, to go after targets that are very deep and inaccessible. And so in terms of reducing Iran's nuclear program significantly, a US role could make a big difference. The United States also can sustain operations over Iran much more effectively. Israel is very, very far from Iran. It's a long distance for its planes to go back and forth. It doesn't have the local bases, but the United States has bases, and if its allies allow access, it can do operations in a much more sustained way with far more forces over Iran with very good munitions. This can affect whatever targets we hit, Iran's military, its broader security infrastructure, and of course its military facility. There's also, though, the question of Iranian retaliation. Now, I think, and others, and welcome others' opinion on this, that we actually don't know how Iran would respond, right? It is plausible to me that they recognize that they're just overmatched, and that fighting the United States now on top of Israel with their limited capacity isn't going to work. And that maybe, revenge is a dish best served cold. They'll just wait a year or two, but they'll figure it out later. But it's also quite plausible to me that, as Mona said, they'll go to various proxies and say, hit whatever you can of the United States. And that could be US bases, it could be US tourists and business people, it can involve international terrorism, that it really could be a much more all-out effort. And I don't think Iran necessarily has made a decision one way or another on that, but I think we have to think of possibilities. And one thing I would stress, we also have to think of possibilities that, from our point of view, seem illogical, because we don't know what information the Iranian leadership is receiving, right? And this is always difficult in peacetime, let alone wartime, where you have a lot of information coming in, some of it conflicting. Add to that Iran's belief that the United States is behind a lot of Israeli actions, even if the United States often sees Israel as acting independently. Iran may believe the United States is going to go to war even if the U.S. doesn't go to war, and respond accordingly. So there's a lot of potential for miscalculation that could really change things right now.
There are lots of points I want to pick up on there. I don't know if any of you had any thoughts about how Iran might retaliate as well.
Well, maybe just to jump in. I mean, I think to Dan's point, certainly we know that Iran has avoided any targeting of U.S. targets, now before the U.S. is involved, precisely to try to avoid bringing the U.S. into the fight. I do think Tehran's calculus shifts should the U.S. get involved, and that there will be a feeling, not that Iran would directly retaliate, but again, what we've seen in the past, we've seen the Iranian playbook, which is the use of proxies, which is they're vastly diminished, but I think Iran would almost feel compelled to have some sort of indirect response. But also, I think the other piece of this, which we've touched on but not really gotten into, is is Iran looking for an off-ramp? And if it is, then I think its calculus, it would not be to engage in retaliatory attacks, but to continue to sort of push for, through Gulf mediators, some way toward negotiations, some way back to the negotiating table. President Trump's rhetoric is making that increasingly difficult. I think earlier today he called for, I think it was unconditional surrender, which in the Iranian culture that's going to be, or frankly in any culture, that's going to be very, very difficult. And so the question would be, I think Iran is looking for a path back to the negotiating table, but they can't do it unconditionally. They would look for some sort of a ceasefire, and then they'd start to perhaps negotiate on the nuclear questions and demonstrate more flexibility. So they may sort of hold back on any sort of significant retaliation if they feel there's a path back to the negotiating table.
And Doreen, what might concessions look like as it relates to Iran's nuclear program?
Yeah, so I think, of course, the one part we're always thinking of is in the enrichment capabilities. So under the original the Iran nuclear deal, Iran wasn't allowed to go beyond, I think it was 3.1 or 3.2% of highly enriched uranium, but then it was using kind of these hedging steps. It went to 20% and 60%, and then there have been even reports that the IAEA had found particles of 83%. So I think the enrichment part is a big part, right, where the international community wants to see a concession, because that is what you will need as the next step to that nuclear weapon. Even though there's still other steps that are missing from really getting a deliverable nuclear warhead, there's a few remaining steps there. I think we hear a lot the reference that Iran has enough enriched uranium to produce 9 to 10 nuclear warheads within a week or two. But we also have to take into account that it still needs to assemble that warhead and then put it on a deliverable vehicle.
Can I add briefly to that? One important question that bedeviled past negotiations was how to think about Iran's other capabilities. And so we often think of a nuclear deal legitimately in nuclear terms, but there is a question of Iran's missile program. As Mona mentioned, Iran has all these proxy networks that are very important. And the decision under President Obama was to kind of break off the nuclear issue and deal with that, and the other stuff would be there and be a problem, but it would be seen as less than the nuclear issue. Many in the Republican Party, including in the past President Trump, criticized exactly that, basically saying you can't break off the nuclear issue, you got to stop Iran's bad behavior. So it's unclear to me whether a deal could be just confined to the nuclear option. Maybe it can, but the broader criticisms of Iran are going to come up in any demands for a ceasefire that would be acceptable to the Israeli or perhaps the U.S. side.
I suppose especially if the feeling is that Iran is at a historic weak point now, then perhaps the feeling is to push forward with those. I do just want to pick up on the US role again, though, and is the way that I'm describing it as a dichotomy of US involvement or no US involvement, is that unhelpful? Is it in reality, is it more likely a gradient of levels of US involvement? And perhaps I can bring in a question from one of our viewers at this point, so from Jack Blackstone, and he says, if Israel is given bunker buster bombs by the US, could they deliver the ordnance and avoid needing US B-2 bombers?
So I think thinking of this as a spectrum is appropriate, but I'll also note there are a few breakpoints on that spectrum. So right now, the United States is currently assisting Israel with air defense as Iranian missiles and drones are shooting at Israel. So that's a significant role. That's not neutrality in any sense of this. The United States has long provided significant military support and intelligence support to Iran. To be clear, I don't know any specifics about how the United States has shaped targeting, but the intelligence relationship in broader terms is well known. And the United States, of course, both provides arms and sells arms to Israel. And so from an Iranian point of view and the point of view of many countries, the United States has already taken sides, right, and is already part of this. I do think, though, there is a difference between the United States helping Israel on defense, helping Israel with weapons, and actively dropping bombs from U.S. aircraft. And one might say that's just part of the spectrum. That could be true analytically. But politically, there is a big difference. And I think President Trump can tell the American people right now, we are not at war. But should the United States start bombing, then the U.S. would be at war. And this question that the audience member asked is an important one, which is really about what can Israel do on its own without U.S. support. And right now, only the United States has these bunker busting munitions, and also only the United States has the platforms that can deliver them. Now, having said that, Israel is a very innovative country militarily, so there are quite possibly ways that could be designed where Israel could drop these through other means. It doesn't have to do exactly what the United States is doing. But that broader question of capability still favors the United States, and thus to go after Iran in a more wholesale way is more effective if the U.S. is involved, even though it involves a lot more risk for the United States.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that last point on what the Israeli options are on Fordo, because we kind of talked about the importance there. And like Dan said, Israel has been showing incredibly creativity and innovative options in its past counter-proliferation efforts against Iran. And especially against Fordo, there's still other things it can do, maybe not have the same effect as the US bunker busters, but it can also target the electricity supply there. It can use lower yield to target the entrances, to temporarily set back developments at Fordo, especially if there's a risk that Iran might currently use the enrichment facility to enrich more uranium. So those are kind of some temporary steps. There's ventilation systems that can be targeted. Or the Israelis might even insert some special forces inside the facility. So I think there's some options that Israel has that we need to think of and not just jump to that conclusion that it must have US support to fully destroy the Fordo facility.
Absolutely, that's helpful, thank you. And so now maybe moving to the Gulf. Yeah. So the role of the Arab Gulf states has shifted a lot as it relates to their stance on US efforts to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran. Of course, back when the JCPOA was being negotiated in 2015, Gulf states were furious not to have been included, and furious to the point that you raised, Dan, about these other issues not being included in those negotiations. Mm-hmm. They wanted to see the regional activities of Iran included in those negotiations. Now, though, they have been playing a much more supportive role in the negotiations that until last week were continued to take place. I think we were due to have the 6th round of direct talks on last Sunday. So, Mona, what's at stake for the Arab Gulf states? And can you explain a bit why this calculation has changed for them and why they were initially supportive of diplomacy and how are they thinking about it now?
Right. No, I mean, I think we've seen a dramatic, I would say almost a 180 shift in the Gulf's views of Iran and U.S. negotiations. You rightly point out, Will, that during the JCPOA, they were quite angry at having been left out of it. we could go back further and look at 2010 when you had the Gulf basically calling on the U.S. to cut the head of the snake, demanding military action to address Iran's nuclear capabilities. So I think what's happened, we've seen a significant shift that in part I think dates to the attack, the Iranian-backed attack on Abqaiq, a major Saudi oil facility in 2019. At that time, the attack took out 50% of the capacity of that oil production facility. And what was notable to the Gulf was that the U.S. didn't respond. And I think that non-response from the U.S. is really what sort of started this shift away, and a decision strategically by the Gulf that they really need to think about how to integrate Iran. And this is what led to the rapprochement, of course, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And those relations have only deepened and warmed since 2023. So much so that if we look at what's happened over the past 5 days, the Gulf countries have really been pretty vocal in their condemnation of Israel. And I think what's at stake here for them is a vision for the Middle East that they believe requires there to be a de-escalation of tensions, a reduction of conflict. These economic diversification plans in Saudi, Vision 2030, for example, is deeply contingent on there being stability in the region and the Saudis' ability to diversify their economies. So new wars, new confrontations breaking out, in no way, shape, or form, I think, works for the Gulf. And that's why I think we're seeing them, at least for now, continue to sort of stand by their position that Iran really needs to be integrated into the region.
And this ties into a question from Hussein Hawaidi from MENACS, who said, in light of recent developments, how are the GCC states currently positioning themselves with respect to the regional crisis? Are they leaning more into de-escalation efforts, even as the GCC continues to express deep concerns about Iran's nuclear program? So how do you see that balance, the concern for the nuclear program versus the de-escalation, particularly at this moment now?
Right. Well, I think, no, we're seeing them really work very, very hard behind the scenes, particularly Oman, which of course has played an important mediating role between the U.S. and Iran. Other traditional mediators like Qatar, we're seeing them step up efforts to really try to de-escalate, get the parties back to the negotiating table. I think it's something we have to recall that, you know, Iran, this is right in the backyard of the Gulf. And so I was speaking to a colleague just earlier today, and he was reminding me, he said, you know, it's only a 4-hour boat ride from Iran to my country. And I think for the Gulf, it's not only that their vision for the region demands that there be stability and a de-escalation, now they have to worry about spillover from instability and conflict in Iran, refugee flows, the incitement of Shia populations in places like Bahrain that has an 80% Shia population. So I think they're actually very, very worried about where all this is going, and that the region could be embarked on an uncontrolled cycle of escalation. This
is a country of 90 million as well, people in Iran, many of whom are already fleeing their homes, but I think the scale of potential displacement as just one of those potential implications could be really quite severe. But Doreen, you wanted to come in?
Can I just expand the scope here and ask a question about, we talked a bit about the Gulf states, but can you speak a bit about what the Russian reaction has been and whether we're expecting more involvement there? But of course, Will and Dan, feel free to chime in as well.
Please.
Well, we've seen Putin offer himself as a potential mediator in all of this. I mean, I think Russia is pragmatic and always looking for ways in which it can seek advantage. My own guess is, and I'm not an expert on Russia, that from the Russian perspective, if the U.S. should decide to engage militarily with Israel and sort of engage now in active operations against Iran, they may see that this could entangle the U.S. militarily in the region, and that they would see that as an advantage and distraction. And so I think they're sort of biding their time. They're watching to see how things evolve. They're going to seek advantage wherever they can. We also have to bear in mind, and I'd be curious as to Dan's views on this, the growing relationship of military cooperation between Russia and Iran. And does Russia choose to perhaps provide more advanced weaponry to Iran? That would be rather provocative. So I don't know. I'm actually curious, Dan, what you think about that.
So as I think many people know, Iranian systems have become quite prevalent in the Russia-Ukraine war, and especially Iranian drone systems. And there are close relations, and in many different capacities, Russia has become more of a chaos agent. So we've seen this in North Korea, we've seen this, and Doreen knows much more than I do, we've seen this in nuclear negotiations, where it's less of a positive agenda of trying to, shape the world and more just trying to throw a spanner in the works for US and European goals on how things should work. And to me, it is at least plausible that when the dust settles a bit, Russia might start providing more weapons and more advanced weapons. Now, to be clear, Russia needs these weapons right now, right? It is fighting a bitter war with Ukraine, and it's not as if it has massive amounts of spare capacity. Having said that, it's really built up its defense industrial base in the last several years with some Chinese assistance. And that will continue should the Russia-Ukraine war end tomorrow. And so if we think a bit more long-term, there is an opening here for Russia, as well as what I suspect would be very strong Iranian demand for more advanced systems.
Could I just pick up on one thing, this idea of Russia as a chaos agent, which I think is exactly right, and sort of seeking to exploit instability wherever it can. It is notable that when the JCPOA was being negotiated, Russia played a critical role alongside us to ensure that Iran would come to the table to add to maximum pressure, et cetera. We're not seeing that now. Right. And it really does raise the question, and Doreen, I don't know what your thinking is on this, as to where is Russia in terms of Iran gaining a nuclear capability? Clearly, before they were opposed, have they shifted their position on this?
Yeah, no, and I think Russia really has not met the expectations from the non-proliferation community there, especially having supported the non-proliferation treaty, which is really the bedrock, right, of non-proliferation. And so I think there was much more expectation that Russia would step up here and help in preventing that Iranian nuclear program from advancing, but it just hasn't. And I think some of in the worst case, it had actually, in some ways, even supported Iran in advancing.
So I want to explore how some of this might play out in the days and weeks ahead, which is always a fraught exercise. But Dan, I'm going to ask you if you might humor me. Could you talk through some of the scenarios that you see as being most likely for where this conflict might go over the coming days, weeks, even months?
So let me give you three.
Great.
The first, which we've been talking about, is the U.S. intervention scenario. So all of a sudden you have a much more decisive shift in the military balance against Iran. You have far more munitions being dropped, at the very least on Iranian nuclear facilities, but probably also Iran's broader military infrastructure. And that could be naval bases, or that could be missile production sites. And with that, there's a significant pressure on Iran to come to the negotiating table, but with a deal that is really dramatically more restrictive than the JCPOA or what's been talked about in the last few months with Iran, where it's really an end to Iranian enrichment of all sorts, and perhaps restrictions on missiles and other things. And there are a lot of permutations. But my sense is if the U.S. intervenes, the price for Iran of peace is going to go up fairly dramatically. The other is actually almost the exact opposite, where the U.S. does intervene, but it is pushing Israel and pushing Iran to come to the table. Now here you have something like a negotiated settlement with, at the very least, a ceasefire and the hope of some broader negotiation over the nuclear program. But the nuclear program would be diminished at least somewhat by the damage done by the Israeli military campaign. But here you get to Doreen's earlier point, which is this, sure, it's diminished, but right now it's, everyone on deck to push this nuclear program forward. So a lot comes with verification and other restrictions in terms of trying to think about that. But the third is that this war doesn't really end, right? And it's a bit of a strange war because it's being conducted 1,000 miles away. Right? So it's not as if there are two armies clashing on a border and one's going to win. right? It strikes back and forth. So you could see certainly a diminishment in pace of Israeli attacks. But on a regular basis, Israel does some bombing in Iran and takes out efforts to renew air defenses and goes after leadership targets. There's sabotage, there's assassination. Iran, meanwhile, is trying to hit Israeli targets in Israel itself if it can, but around the world. In the past, Iran has gone after Jewish targets, claiming they are identical to Israeli targets. So you could see not exactly a forever war, but like a forever skirmish, where there's back and forth, there's not quite normalcy, but at the same time, it's hardly all-out war. I'm sure there are other permutations that others may want to kind of add to that.
Maybe if I could just jump in on that, and I think you've laid the scenarios down well. I guess for me, the second scenario of the U.S. not intervening militarily, but actually taking a more active position to negotiate and de-escalate this conflict and bring Iran to task, perhaps negotiate a more effective, more stringent deal. To my mind, that sort of holds the promise of where I was going initially, which is the Gulf is looking for kind of more stability in the region. It holds the promise of perhaps de-escalating tensions, etc. The issue with the third and the first scenarios, I think, raises a much bigger question about there are no rules anymore governing the Middle East. These various military interventions at will, the sense that all red lines have essentially been transgressed. And again, speaking to those from the region, they raise worries about, well, whatever happened to kind of the international rules-based order, and how does that apply here or not? And so I think it raises a much bigger, scarier question about not just what kind of Middle East that is, but what are the implications beyond the Middle East globally for kind of a region that's just utterly off the rails and ungoverned by any rules. And then the last point I'll make is I think those kinds of chaotic scenarios 1 and 3, also do have implications here at home, right, in terms of prices at the gas pump and just broader instability, supply chain questions. We've seen that already with the Houthis and their interventions in the Red Sea, adding to shipping times and prices and so forth. So I think both of those are really kind of really frightening scenarios in terms of not just for the region, but with real implications and reverberations globally.
And perhaps to continue on the theme of frightening implications for the world, Doreen, I wonder if you could share what you think some of the implications of this war are for non-proliferation or proliferation, elsewhere in the region, but also more broadly around the world.
Yeah, I think this is a crucial question, especially as we see the nuclear order already crumbling quite a bit. And Iran is not the only issue that the nuclear community faces. But let me just touch maybe on 3 points, the NPT, the IAEA, and the third one, what it means for actors that might be interested in proliferation. I think the first one, the NPT, we've seen or heard that actually Iran is considering to introduce a bill, or is actually drafting a bill to withdraw from the NPT. So that would have huge implications for the non-proliferation community, and that's something they would have to wrestle with. It would, of course, in some ways hurt that regime. But we also have to be careful to say that all non-proliferation efforts then will go down the drain. I think there's other past examples like North Korea, where the NPT in some ways survived that, and there's still 190 countries that are part of the NPT, and that all agree that non-proliferation is the way forward, and that they don't want additional actors proliferating. The second one, the IAEA, I think here we'll see that the IAEA will be weakened by that, probably have less access to Iran's production and stocks. And we already, after the Iranian nuclear deal, after it broke down, the IAEA lost its ability to surveil the country. So we'll probably see that continue to break down. And then I think the third one is to look at what does the message of the Israeli strikes send to other states that might be interested in proliferation. And I think one of the arguments here is that others may be thinking to go that step is too risky and too costly, but I think we have to be careful to make that assessment, because Israel as a counter-proliferation actor is very unique. We haven't seen that type of aggressive preventative actions from any other country, and we haven't seen that when India and Pakistan proliferated. So I think whether that sends a message to other states proliferating, we need to be careful there.
And just to make sure I've understood, are you saying that other states might take the lesson that if Iran had nuclear weapons capabilities, they would not have suffered from this attack, and therefore it might encourage others to pursue nuclear capabilities?
I think that's a lesson that some would take away, just how that was maybe an implication of Ukraine, right? If Ukraine would have had nuclear weapons, would have had Russia attacked. But that's, something that's really hard to assess and really hard to measure because it's so hypothetical.
Can I ask a this is fascinating. Would Israel's campaign allow other states to justify their operations in the name of counterproliferation? Right. So Russia saying, Poland, you're thinking of getting a nuclear weapon. That's unacceptable. We're going in, or China with South Korea. I mean, you would know the examples better than I, but can it be a rationale?
Yeah, I think in some ways it would almost legitimize Israeli actions and aggressive counter-proliferation actions, right? A lot of these type of attacks are violating international law and is oftentimes almost ignored, or just a tap on the hand and it's verbally condemned and saying, oh, you can't do that. But in the end, we're also seeing that there's a part of the international community that supports this type of actions. But I think most importantly, that type of action to go and use counter-proliferation actions, it delegitimizes the IAEA and international law and treaties and agreements that countries came to in a formal manner.
And in a piece you put out recently, you drew some comparisons between Israel's past counter-proliferation operations in both Syria and in Iraq, which led in quite different directions. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so very different scenarios. Of course, Iraq and Syria, they were very single activities and locations. So Israel used kind of the surgical strikes there before the programs were as advanced as Iran's program. And now we're seeing a full-out campaign of assassinations of the Iranian scientists, the airstrikes, taking out the Natanz facility, but also targeting some of the other facilities that provide equipment for the nuclear program. So the campaign was very different than it was in Iraq and Syria. So, yeah.
And Dan, one of the scenarios that you did not lay out is regime collapse. And we've had a lot of interest from the audience in exploring that in some more detail. So noting that you did not lay that out as one of the most likely scenarios, a question from Susanna, who identified herself as an analyst, said, what are the signposts to watch for that the current conflict could lead to the collapse of the Iranian regime?
Let me give a short-term and long-term perspective. We can imagine, or at least I can imagine, two primary paths to regime change in Iran. One is popular unrest that kind of leads the regime to collapse. And that, in some ways, is a variant of the Islamic Revolution itself, the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And the other is a military coup. And a military coup is harder right now because the military actually is having trouble talking to itself. So a coup demands quick, coordinated actions where forces move decisively. And Israel is disrupting communications in Iran, is targeting military leaders. So it's harder to actually pull off a coup. And the Iranian regime has actually carefully controlled the leadership of the armed forces. In fact, they're so integrated, it's actually kind of hard to sort out because so many of the people in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are have political leadership positions as well. So I think a coup is unlikely in the short term. And popular unrest is unlikely. People are fleeing Tehran. It's not a great time to kind of go march in a big square. People are looking to their families. And this is, in general, it's very hard for outsiders to inspire popular unrest. Very few people are excited about a foreigner telling them to rise up against their own government. And when that foreigner is Israel or the United States, it's less likely given kind of the broader associations in many countries with them. So I think the short-term scenarios are unlikely. A signpost I'd look for military operations, though, would be targeting regime security forces for the internal security. So in Iran, this is the besieged forces, and they have several dedicated units focused on internal security. And to my knowledge, and to be clear, there's quite a bit I don't know, Israel has not targeted those units or their leadership. But taking out the ability to quash unrest would be something I'd watch. And then, of course, it's very hard to detect a coup from the outside. But for popular unrest, you would look for size of the crowds. You would look for how quickly it spreads from city to city. Is it simply a Tehran thing, or is it spreading to other cities? I will ask others to join in on this, but I will note the long term's a little different. And here there's a question mark. For those who study the Middle East past, there's a fairly long tradition of military defeat or humiliation followed by a coup. And the legitimacy of many of these regimes is predicated on defense of the country. In Iran's case, it's very much predicated on standing up to Israel and standing up to the United States. And to fail, not just in a general sense, but in a rather humiliating sense, where Israel does these dramatic intelligence operations that show penetration of the Iranian system, that embarrassment is the sort of thing that discredits existing leaders and may lead some leaders in the military or elsewhere to say, the problem is the current leadership, we need to change things. But I don't think that's going to happen sooner, and there would be a lot of factors that would be involved in that long-term calculation, not just current military operations.
I mean, I think those scenarios you laid down, Dan, sound right. I mean, I think for me the bigger question is just broader instability. I mean, there's been discussion, for example, or President Trump has talked about, we know where the supreme leader is hiding, and we're not going to target him yet. But it raises these bigger questions of just the promotion of widespread instability and power vacuums opening up, not necessarily with organized protests then stepping in and taking over, but just sort of an amalgam of all kinds of kind of chaotic developments that really we don't know where they go. And I think that's almost a bigger concern. Maybe more of a medium term, I don't know. But I mean, I guess one question back is, what if the supreme leader is taken out and assassinated? What does that look like from your vantage point?
So if he's taken out, I think in the short term, they have a succession plan, or at least a succession process. And I think the system can function without him and will function without him. And I think, though, it would be something that would be enraging from an Iranian regime point of view. Now, the caveat to all this was, if you look at the Hezbollah operation in September and October of last year, where, of course, Hassan Nasrallah, this incredibly important, charismatic figure, very much at the center of Hezbollah's identity, Israel kills him, and there's outrage in Hezbollah. But then they kill leader after leader, commander after commander, take out capability after capability. And right now, Hezbollah is saying very clearly, we want to stay out of this. So one Israeli argument might be, sure, there'll be a short-term spike in anger, but the way these campaigns succeed is you go after leadership more broadly, not individual leaders. And if we can make it clear we can target you anytime, anywhere, that despite their own desires, Iran may be forced to come to the table.
So,
just 2 cents here on, I think the uncertainty we've been talking about is exactly why the international community doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. Because it thinks that, or justifies that, this takes these reasons because we don't know if the nuclear weapons will then fall into the wrong hands because of that risk of regime change and instability in the country.
And someone who identified himself as David, who asked this question on YouTube, said, could the following strategic considerations, cutting off China from a source of cheap oil, depriving Russia of affordable Iranian drones and key imports, halting Iran's nuclear program, and possibly achieving regime change, combined with domestic political pressures, be enough to convince President Trump to pursue a land invasion of Iran? I think that's probably quite extreme, but I wonder, could it convince him to increase the U.S. involvement in this conflict?
If I could just jump in on that question, I mean, I think if we sort of go back even just a couple weeks, we should recall that President Trump was really staking his policies and positioning in the Middle East on avoiding any more forever wars. And he was really eschewing military intervention. And in speeches he gave during his trip to the Gulf, he sort of criticized earlier efforts by the U.S. at nation building and so forth, very specifically. So not only, do I think coming in with ground forces is highly, highly, highly unlikely. I mean, I see if the U.S. does get involved, it'll be in an air war. But I do think President Trump does have to weigh whatever decision he takes on intervening militarily against what he campaigned on and against, frankly, how much of his base seems to feel about military intervention, which is that people are not interested in the U.S. Once again sort of finding itself enmeshed and entangled in a long-term military intervention. That's why I think no matter how compelling some of those reasons might be, and we could push back on how realistic they are, I think that there is still this domestic political question that is still quite significant for the president in terms of how these decisions might be taken.
I think this leads to another question from a colleague of ours at CSIS, Natalia, who says, what would increased US intervention in the Israel-Iran conflict signal about its broader strategic priorities, US broader strategic priorities, and foreign policy relations with key Middle Eastern powers? Would this be, would it be the 180 that we've been discussing that the Gulf states took? Would this be a 180 for President Trump's policy in the region?
I mean, I think it would be an upending of where things were a month ago, where the president, remember, there was some almost, on paper anyway, $2 trillion of deals signed, major investment deals with the Qataris, with the Emiratis, with the Saudis. All of that in the name of a sort of a seemingly new approach. There was no Trump doctrine, but a new approach that really prioritized economic engagements, big deals that would bring investment into the U.S. All of that, I think, kind of goes up in smoke in a sense if the U.S. gets involved militarily and finds itself once again on a war footing in the Middle East. And I don't think this is something that I think would in no way, shape, or form be favored by Gulf Arab states as well.
Yeah, I think this would hurt also all options for any nuclear talks. I think what we've seen on Truth Social earlier today, but also yesterday, I think is a way maybe of the president to put pressure on Iran to come to the negotiating table. I'm not sure that he has changed his views on getting entangled in another conflict in the Middle East.
I mean, it's very hard, of course, to predict President Trump. The rhetoric in the last 24 hours has changed a lot. And one small factoid, if you will, was the president was very critical of Tucker Carlson, who has long been extremely opposed to the U.S. going to war in Iran. And that's part of his constituency. So there are possibilities in terms of what might happen, but as Mona said, this would be a huge change. I'll kind of add and foot stomp 2 points. One is there was supposed to be a greater U.S. emphasis on China and less on the Middle East. Now, people who are a little older who are watching this may smile because they'll say, oh, I remember when President Obama said that. And I remember when they tried to do that and Trump won, and President Biden was trying to do that. So the Middle East does tend to suck the United States back in despite the wishes of U.S. strategists. But the second point is, as Mona said, when Iran attacked Saudi Arabia in the past, the United States really did nothing. And so, yes, President Trump has at times been involved in the Middle East, but it's not the high-profile, sustained engagement that past administrations had done and that President Biden's administration had done. And this would be a real shift. This is something that would make the Middle East much more front and center. It's not a one-off. It's not a deal. And so it would put the United States back in the Middle East in a way I'm not sure the administration, at least a month ago, wanted to do.
And I want to give you each a moment to sort of provide any final thoughts you have. But Mona, firstly, I do want to ask you a question that has come from Ibad Rahman, who said, has this conflict fundamentally shifted the balance of deterrence in the Middle East or set the stage for a new cycle of escalation and instability? Yeah. I mean, we've touched on that before.
Right.
But
well, and I think, we talked a little bit about has Israel achieved escalation dominance, which I think, is part of this equation. I think the issue really is more about the fact that the rules of the game have been upended. And I think that's what I think is most dangerous. It begs the question of how to restore deterrence, and it begs the question of how does the region find its way back to a situation in which there are clear guardrails, there are clear rules of the game, there are clear principles that all parties are respecting. In the absence of that, I fear that we really are heading into, unfortunately, a very, very chaotic and very dangerous Middle East.
Doreen, any final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think especially you'll be surprised hearing me talk about the nuclear side of things. But yeah, I think what we're watching here for the most is what actions Israel will take with Fordo, or what it can take, whether it will be as creative as we've been discussing, but also what it will do with some of the others. One other important site is the Isfahan facility, where until recently was suspected that there's the enriched stockpile from the Iranian nuclear program. We're not sure if that has been moved, but this is another important site for the nuclear program. So yeah, we're watching what Israel will do, since they have been saying that this is an unfinished campaign and that it will continue to go on. And then the other part, of course, is the U.S. Involvement there. Will push for negotiations and diplomacy continue, or will we really see that shift in strategy there?
Thank you. Dan?
I'll give my final thoughts really about the sustainability from the Israeli side. And Israel's military was not designed to fight long wars. It's very much a reserve force, and it is a small country. And it's been at war in Gaza and in Lebanon for almost 2 years now. And that has put tremendous strain on parts of the Israeli population. And now you have this additional war. Now, it's involving different assets. It's not like there are tens of thousands of ground forces being involved. But when you have large numbers of civilians regularly going to shelters, there are estimates that the cost of the war is about $300 million a day. And Israel's economy will find it hard to sustain this burden indefinitely. And so you have a country that's at war on multiple fronts for long periods of time. And the population after October 7th is willing to bear pretty heavy burdens. So it's not as if there are mass protests about the need to go to war, but it is something that is draining and causing strain within Israel. And to me, there are questions about how sustainable Israel's policies are in the long term, given the way the society is set up.
Mona, anything final to add?
I mean, no, I think my colleagues have touched on all the key points.
So I think you have both. You've given us some ideas of things to watch out for in the days and weeks ahead. Whether Israel starts targeting internal security forces in Iran, not just targeting Fordo, but also Isfahan, the regional ripple effects and how that might change the calculations of some of the Arab Gulf states. I think you've also given some nuance to some of these ideas that are being thrown around. It may not be as clear as the US entering or not entering this conflict. It's more of a gradient, but also to think through the strain on the Israeli forces, thinking through the fact that we don't really know very much about what Iranian leadership, what information they have access to, and how that might shape their thinking. So we will, and then I think, Mona, a really important piece that you raised is just to zoom out and realize that we really have upended, or these strikes have upended the rules of the game in the region, and then that could have implications far beyond it. So there is a huge amount more to discuss. I hope that you will join me again to think more about this and better understand everything that's playing out. I just want to say a few thanks. Thank you to Alex, to Eric and Dinesh and the streaming and broadcasting team, to Nina and Brianna in the Middle East program who pulled this all together at really short notice. And of course, thank you so much to you for joining me today, and thank you to the audience for watching online. To follow the latest analysis, please go to the CSIS website, and you will see a plethora of pieces from our experts across the building.